The school hall buzzed with excitement. Students whispered to each other, some sitting on the edges of their chairs, others craning their necks to get a better view of the empty stage at the front. It wasn't every day that a billionaire came to their school. For most of them, the word billionaire was something they only heard on the news, connected with skyscrapers, companies, and faraway lives that had nothing to do with their own. But today was different. Today, someone from that world was walking into theirs. The man's name was Mr. Harrison. Everyone in the city knew him. He owned businesses, gave speeches, and his photo was often in newspapers. But here, in this small school filled with students from hard-working families, his visit felt almost unreal. The teachers had spent weeks preparing for it. The hall was cleaned until it shone. Banners were hung with messages about success and education. And the kitchen staff planned a special lunch that would be shared with him. David, a 14-year-old black student, sat quietly near the middle row. He wasn't as loud as some of his classmates, but his eyes always paid attention. His mother had taught him to notice details, things others often overlooked. That habit stayed with him whether he was solving math problems, fixing his little brother's toys, or just observing the world around him. Today, though, he was just another student waiting for the guest to arrive. The air shifted when the doors opened. Teachers straightened up, students sat taller, and a hush fell over the room. Mr. Harrison entered, tall and confident, wearing a suit that looked like it had been made just for him. His smile was wide, practiced, the kind of smile that had charmed audiences all over the world. But here, among children, it looked almost too polished. Still, the students clapped, some even cheering. For them, this was more than just a guest, it was a glimpse into another world. Mr. Harrison raised a hand, acknowledging their welcome. "Thank you," he said warmly. "It's wonderful to be here with all of you today." The principal beamed with pride as he guided Mr. Harrison to the stage. A microphone was set up, and soon the billionaire was speaking. He told the students about his childhood, how he had grown up with little but dreamed big. He spoke of working hard, building businesses, and never giving up. His voice was smooth, his words carefully chosen, the kind of speech designed to inspire. Some students listened with wide eyes, imagining themselves in his place one day. Others fidgeted, half distracted by the thought of the free lunch waiting after the talk. David listened too, but his sharp eyes wandered to the people preparing trays at the side of the hall. He noticed the meals being placed carefully, the steam rising, the smell of spices drifting through the room. Something about it pulled his attention. Though he didn't yet know why, after the speech, the principal announced, "Now we will all share a meal together. Mr. Harrison has kindly agreed to eat the same lunch as our students, to show his connection to the community." The teachers smiled proudly. The idea making the moment feel more intimate, more meaningful. Mr. Harrison stepped down from the stage, still smiling, shaking a few hands as he made his way to the table prepared for him. The trays of food were lined up neatly, and the billionaire picked one up without hesitation. Cameras clicked, teachers and local reporters capturing the humble image of a billionaire dining with students. The hall filled with chatter again. Students leaned over their trays, laughing, trading bites of food. Mr. Harrison sat at the front, a fork in his hand, talking with the principal beside him. To everyone, it seemed like a perfect afternoon, a rare moment when two worlds, so far apart, came together. But in the middle row, David's eyes stayed locked on that tray of food. His classmates laughed and nudged him, but he didn't laugh back. Something about the smell, the way the dish looked, nagged at his memory. He remembered his younger brother's illness months ago, the night he had eaten something that looked almost the same. He remembered his mother's panic, the rush to the hospital, the doctor's words, "He's lucky you noticed in time." David blinked, his stomach tightening. His instincts told him something wasn't right. He watched as Mr. Harrison lifted his fork, about to take the first bite. And in that moment, the unlikely meeting a billionaire and a school of children shifted from ordinary to extraordinary. The story that began with smiles and cameras was about to twist into something no one expected. Asterisk, the buzz of the assembly lingered even after Mr. Harrison's speech ended. Teachers clapped, students whispered, and the sound of chairs scraping filled the hall as everyone prepared for the shared lunch. The billionaire's words still echoed about hard work, chasing dreams, and building success, but for many kids, their focus had already shifted to the trays of food now being placed on tables. Mr. Harrison, used to elegant banquets and expensive dishes, looked down at the school lunch set before him. A plain tray with rice, vegetables, and a side dish. Nothing fancy. To the cameras waiting in the corner, it was a photo opportunity. To the principal, it was a proud symbol that their guest was willing to sit with the children, eat the same meal, and show he was one of them. The billionaire smiled as he adjusted his chair. He picked up the fork, glancing around the room. Students were watching him with wide eyes, some giggling at the thought of a man worth billions eating the same food they sometimes grumbled about. To Mr. Harrison, it was a harmless, even charming gesture. He thought of how the newspapers might describe it later. Billionaire joined students for humble school lunch. He could already imagine the headlines. The teachers leaned in, eager to capture the moment. The principal beamed with pride, whispering to a reporter, "See? He's not above our children. He respects them." For a few seconds, everything seemed perfect. A billionaire blending into the everyday life of students. No barriers of money or power, just a shared meal on a shared afternoon. The innocence of the gesture touched everyone in the hall. It was a rare image, wealth, and simplicity meeting in one quiet act. But as Mr. Harrison lifted the fork, the food trembling slightly at the edge, David's eyes caught every detail. He wasn't impressed by the billionaire's smile or distracted by the cameras. His sharp gaze fixed on the dish itself, the odd sheen of the sauce, the faint smell that didn't match what it was supposed to be. It was the kind of detail most would ignore, but not David. He remembered his little brother. The night he had gotten sick from spoiled food that looked just like this. He remembered the cries, the ambulance lights, and the doctor's serious voice saying, "If you hadn't acted fast, it could have been much worse." That memory had carved itself deep inside David's mind. Now, sitting in that noisy hall, surrounded by laughter and chatter, the memory resurfaced with alarming clarity. His stomach tightened. His palms grew sweaty. His mind screamed at him, "Something's wrong." "Don't let him eat it." Mr. Harrison chuckled politely at a teacher's joke, then turned back to his meal. He raised a fork higher, closer to his mouth. The billionaire didn't notice the nervous eyes of the boy watching him. He didn't see how David's face had gone pale, how his body leaned forward as though ready to spring out of his seat. The innocence of the gesture eating. Students' lunch to appear humble suddenly carried danger that no one else in the room had noticed. To everyone else, it was an act of kindness, a symbol of connection. To David, it was a moment ticking down like a clock, each second heavier than the last. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Should he say something? Would anyone even believe him? He was just a student, and the man at the table was a billionaire, surrounded by teachers and reporters. But the thought of staying quiet made his chest tighten even more. He knew if he stayed silent, he would never forgive himself. And so, as the fork hovered inches from Mr. Harrison's mouth, David felt the decision ignite inside him like fire. He pushed back his chair suddenly, the screech of its legs startling a few nearby classmates. His body shook, but his voice, when it finally burst out, was louder than he thought possible. "Don't eat that." The words cut through the noise of the hall like a blade. Conversations stopped. Forks froze mid-air. Every head turned toward the small boy standing in the middle row. His eyes locked on the billionaire for a moment. Time itself seemed to pause. Mr. Harrison blinked. Confused, his fork suspended just before his lips. The cameras caught the exact second of hesitation. His smile faltering as silence spread across the room. The innocent gesture meant to bring pride and connection was suddenly interrupted by the voice of a single student. A voice trembling with fear, urgency, and something stronger. Courage. Nobody in the hall yet understood why David had shouted. Nobody except David himself. And in that frozen second, the weight of his words pressed heavily on the billionaire, the teachers, the students, and the neighbors of silence. The story, which had begun as an inspiring speech and a humble meal, had just taken a turn none of them would ever forget. All eyes in the hall turned toward David. His voice still echoed in the silence he had created. "Don't eat that." For a moment, it felt like even the air had stopped moving. Forks hovered in midair, chairs remained half-shifted, and every gaze locked onto the boy who dared interrupt a billionaire. Mr. Harrison froze, his fork trembling slightly. His polished smile vanished, replaced with a frown of confusion. He glanced at the teachers, then back at the boy who had spoken. "What did you say?" His voice was calm, but there was a trace of disbelief. Like he couldn't imagine a student would shout at him in front of everyone. David's heart thudded in his chest. His knees wobbled, and part of him wished he could sink into the floor. But the memory of his little brother lying in a hospital bed burned too strongly in his mind. That memory gave him strength. He swallowed hard, his voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. "I said, don't eat that," David repeated, his eyes fixed on the tray. The principal's face turned red, embarrassment and anger mixing together. "David," he hissed, "sit down this instant. You are being disrespectful." Some students giggled nervously, unsure whether to treat this as a joke or a serious warning. Others stared, wide-eyed, sensing something was not right. But David didn't move. His body shook, but his voice grew stronger. "Please, just don't eat it. Something's wrong with the food." The words hung heavy. Teachers exchanged confused looks. One whispered to another, "Is this some kind of prank?" Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, setting the fork down slowly. His sharp eyes studied the boy with curiosity now, not anger. "What do you mean?" he asked. David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He pointed toward the dish. "The smell? It's off. The sauce looks spoiled. My brother got sick once from food that looked exactly like that. He almost didn't make it." His voice cracked at the memory, but he pushed on. "I can tell. Something's wrong." A ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. The billionaire glanced down at the tray, suddenly unsure. Until now, the food had seemed harmless, even ordinary. But now, under David's words, it looked different, too glossy, too heavy. With a faint sourness that tickled the nose once you thought about it, the principal tried to laugh it off nervously. "Children exaggerate. The food is perfectly fine. Our staff prepared it with care." His voice wavered, betraying his own doubt. But David's words had already planted a seed in everyone's mind. Some students sniffed at their own trays, wrinkling their noses. A teacher set down her fork uncertainly. And the billionaire, who had built his empire on instincts and reading people, saw something in David's eyes that was impossible to ignore. Pure, honest fear. Mr. Harrison's brow furrowed. "You really believe this food is dangerous?" David nodded hard, his fists clenched at his sides. "Yes, please don't eat it. Don't let anyone eat it." The hall buzzed louder now. Some students began pushing their trays away, their laughter gone. The kitchen staff shifted uncomfortably at the side of the hall, whispering to each other, suddenly pale. The billionaire leaned back, crossing his arms. He was a man used to hearing polished speeches, flattery, and lies. But this boy's voice was different, shaking. Yes, but filled with conviction. It was the kind of conviction you couldn't fake. He turned slowly to the principal. "Have this food checked." Now, the principal hesitated, sweat forming at his temple. "But, sir, it's just a child's now," Mr. Harrison repeated, his voice sharper this time. The command carried weight. Staff scrambled. One of the teachers rushed to the kitchen, returning minutes later with a nervous look. "Sir, the chicken in the dish it's past its safe date. It should not have been served." Gasps filled the hall. Students pushed their trays farther away. Teachers whispered in alarm. And the billionaire's fork, still resting on his plate, looked suddenly dangerous, like it had nearly been a weapon against him. David stood frozen, his chest rising and falling quickly. He couldn't believe it himself. He had spoken, and he had been right. The billionaire stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, his expression softened. He leaned forward, his voice low but audible across the hushed hall. "You may have just saved me. And not just me, everyone here." David's eyes widened, his heart skipping. Around him, students began whispering his name. Some looked at him with awe, others with guilt for laughing at him only moments before. And at the front of the hall, Mr. Harrison sat in silence, shaken not by the spoiled food, but by the courage of a single student who noticed what no one else had. The gesture that was supposed to be simple and symbolic had turned into something life-changing. Asterisk. The hall was no longer filled with laughter and chatter. It was filled with silence so heavy that even the sound of a dropped pin could have been heard. The words, "Don't eat that," still echoed inside every student's ears. What had started as an innocent school event had suddenly shifted into something far more serious. Mr. Harrison sat frozen, the fork still lying on his plate, untouched. His eyes were fixed on David, the student who had dared to interrupt him. A billionaire used to respect formality and polished speeches was now staring at a trembling teenager who had shouted at him in front of everyone. The principal looked ready to collapse. His face was flushed, his hands shaking as he tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous," he barked, forcing a laugh. "Children and their imaginations. Mr. Harrison, please, ignore him." But nobody was laughing. The students, who had moments ago been excited to share a meal with a billionaire, now stared at their trays with unease. Some pushed them away. Others sniffed suspiciously at the food. The teachers exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence crumbling, and David stood there, his fists clenched, his heart racing. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, and it scared him. But the fear of staying quiet was greater. His voice shook, but he spoke again. "I'm telling the truth. Something is wrong with the food. Please believe me." The billionaire leaned back in his chair, studying the boy carefully. His instincts, sharpened from years of making business deals and reading people, told him this wasn't just a prank. There was something in David's eyes, fear, yes, but also conviction. Then came the freeze. Mr. Harrison's body stilled. Every movement halted as his mind processed the weight of those words. He glanced at the tray in front of him, at the sauce that now seemed less appetizing, more suspicious. His fork had been only inches away from his mouth. But now he felt as if he had narrowly stepped away from danger. The cameras, which had been ready to capture cheerful photos of a billionaire eating school lunch, were now pointed at his face. Catching the exact moment, his smile disappeared. For once, Mr. Harrison didn't care about the image being recorded. He cared about the truth behind the boy's warning. "Explain," he said, finally, his voice low but commanding. David swallowed hard. His classmates leaned forward, the entire hall hanging on his words. "The food smells off," he began. His voice trembled, but he pressed on. "It's the same smell I noticed when my little brother got food poisoning last year. He almost didn't make it. It's the same look, the same taste in the air. Please, sir, don't eat it. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Teachers whispered frantically. Students pushed their trays farther away. The principal opened his mouth to dismiss the boy again, but the billionaire raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Get this food tested," Mr. Harrison ordered, his voice sharper now. Kitchen staff hurried back and forth, confusion and fear spreading across their faces. Within minutes, whispers confirmed the unthinkable. The chicken had been left unrefrigerated too long. It was spoiled. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs. Students covered their mouths, some horrified, others amazed. The teachers looked pale. And in the center of it all, David stood frozen, unable to believe he had actually stopped something so dangerous. The billionaire sat back, his face drained of color. For a man who had built skyscrapers, signed billion-dollar contracts, and traveled the world, it wasn't money or power that saved him that day. It was the sharp eyes and brave voice of a single student. The freeze lingered, not just in his body, but in his mind. He realized how close he had been to disaster. And even more shocking was the fact that no adult, no official, no wealthy guest had noticed. It was a boy once student among many who had seen what others ignored. The billionaire's eyes locked on David again. For the first time in years, he felt humbled. Slowly, he nodded. "You may have saved my life," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. David's classmates gasped, turning toward him with new respect. Some whispered his name like he was a hero. Others looked guilty for laughing at him earlier. David himself felt his knees go weak, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to process it all. And so the shout, those three words that had seemed out of place in a school assembly, became the turning point of the day. The billionaire froze, not because of fear alone, but because of the realization that wealth and power could not protect him from everything. Sometimes it was the voice of someone small, someone overlooked, that held the greatest truth. The hall, once noisy and cheerful, now carried a heavy silence filled with lessons unspoken. And though the moment had passed, the weight of David's shout would linger forever in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Mr. Harrison sat motionless. His hand, still resting on the edge of the table, felt unusually heavy. The fork he had been holding only minutes ago now lay abandoned on the tray, its shiny metal glinting under the hall's bright lights. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply froze. The silence around him deepened. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they should whisper or wait. Teachers stood stiff, their eyes darting between the boy who had spoken and the billionaire who no longer looked so untouchable. The hall was still packed with noise from moments ago, but now even the faintest sound seemed to loud chairs creaking, papers rustling, breaths catching in throats. David, standing in the middle row, felt his own body tense as if he, too, had frozen. His heart thumped hard enough to echo in his ears. He had done what he thought was right, but now the weight of it pressed down on him. He had shouted at a billionaire. He had interrupted the most important guest their school had ever seen. Would he be punished? Or worse, humiliated? But Mr. Harrison's face wasn't angry. It wasn't mocking or dismissive. It was pale. His sharp, confident eyes, used to closing business deals and staring down powerful men, now looked unsettled, as though for the first time in years. He had been caught off guard. He looked at the tray of food again, really looked. The sauce that had seemed warm and inviting now looked darker, too thick, almost slimy. The faint, sour smell suddenly grew stronger, as if his mind had opened to details he hadn't noticed before. He realized how close he had been to lifting that fork to his mouth, how close he had been to swallowing something dangerous, for a man who had everything, who had lived his life believing he could control any situation. That realization was paralyzing. The freeze wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological, in that moment. The billionaire understood something that shook him to his core. His wealth, his status, his power, none of it had protected him. A boy, a student barely in his teens, had seen what he did not. And if not for that boy, he might have been the one collapsing on the floor while cameras flashed and people screamed. The principal cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Mr. Harrison, please, this is all just a misunderstanding." But the billionaire raised his hand sharply, silencing him. His eyes never left David. The students held their breath. What would he say? Would he scold the boy? Would he dismiss the warning? Or would he acknowledge what everyone now knew, that David had saved him? Finally, Mr. Harrison spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried through the entire hall. "Do you understand?" he said slowly. "How close I came to eating this." He looked around the room, his gaze sharp again but heavy with something new: vulnerability. "Do you all realize what just happened?" The words made the students murmur again, their voices buzzing like bees. They had seen the moment with their own eyes, yet hearing him admit it made the truth sink deeper. Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture uncharacteristic of the polished billionaire the public always saw. It wasn't the gesture of a man in control, it was the gesture of a man who had just stared at danger and realized he hadn't even seen it coming. David swallowed hard, his small frame trembling, but he held the billionaire's gaze. Their eyes locked, the boy who had shouted and the man who had frozen. For a moment, the entire world seemed to exist in that unspoken exchange. Then, slowly, Mr. Harrison nodded. "You stopped me," he said, his voice steady but softer now. "And for that, I owe you." Gasps echoed around the hall. Students looked at each other, whispering, "He thanked him." Teachers shifted nervously, realizing that the narrative of the day had just changed. The event wasn't about a billionaire inspiring children. Anymore, it was about a child saving a billionaire. The freeze still lingered in Mr. Harrison's body, though. He could feel it in his chest, in the cold sweat forming on his palms. He was shaken, not just because of spoiled food, but because of the humbling reminder that life could turn in an instant. All his money, his power, his polished speeches, none of it mattered when a simple school lunch could bring him down. And the fact that it was a boy, a student no one expected, who had stopped him made the freeze even stronger. It wasn't just fear. It was realization. It was humility. The hall was no longer the same. The students who had been buzzing with excitement at the billionaire's presence now sat in awe of one of their own. The teachers who had wanted to impress their guest now exchanged uneasy glances. And the billionaire himself remained still, frozen in thought. As the truth settled deeper into his mind, the freeze would pass. But the lesson it carried would remain long after the food was cleared away and the cameras were gone. The billionaire's words, "You stopped me," still hung in the air like a stone dropped into water, rippling through every corner of the hall. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Students shifted in their seats, teachers avoided eye contact. And even the principal stood frozen, his authority crumbling. All eyes turned back to David, the boy who had dared to interrupt and who now stood at the center of it all. David's chest rose and fell quickly. His palms were damp, his knees shaky, but the moment demanded more than silence. Everyone was waiting for him to explain. He glanced at Mr. Harrison, then at the untouched tray of food on the table, and finally at the rows of classmates staring with curiosity, doubt, and awe. He took a deep breath, steadying his voice. "The food? It's not safe." Gasps rippled across the hall. A few students pushed their trays farther away, their faces turning pale. Teachers leaned in, listening with sudden seriousness. David pressed on, his voice trembling but growing stronger with each word. "I've seen this before. My little brother got really sick once after eating food that looked just like this. The smell is sour, it's spoiled. He had food poisoning, and the doctor said if we hadn't acted fast, it could have been so much worse. His throat tightened at the memory, but he didn't stop. When I saw the same thing on your plate, sir, I knew I had to say something. The hall buzzed with whispers, students repeating his words to one another. A teacher at the back sniffed at her tray, then pushed it away with a frown. The truth was spreading, cutting through the doubt like sunlight breaking clouds. Mr. Harrison sat still. His eyes locked on David, the polished businessman used to numbers and contracts. Now looked humbled before a boy whose words carried more weight than any boardroom speech. You recognized it? From your brother? He asked quietly. David nodded. Yes, sir. I couldn't just watch and stay quiet. The kitchen staff exchanged panicked looks. One of them hurried forward, whispering urgently to the principal. The principal's face turned red as he muttered, "That batch. It wasn't supposed to be served." Someone mixed it up. His voice cracked with embarrassment. And he wiped sweat from his forehead. The revelation spread quickly. The chicken had been left unrefrigerated too long. It was spoiled, unsafe, and never should have been on the tables. The staff had made a mistake. But it was a child who had caught it. The students gasped louder now, fear mingling with gratitude. He saved us, one whispered. David saved all of us. The billionaire leaned back, letting out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. His hands shook slightly as he stared at the plate. The danger he had nearly swallowed. The freeze from before deepened into something heavier, realization. He turned toward David again. His voice quieter but carrying across the hushed hall. Do you understand what you've done? You didn't just stop me. You may have saved hundreds of us in this room. David's classmates stared at him. Differently now, not as the quiet boy who kept to himself, but as someone brave, someone who had spoken when no one else dared. His face flushed, and he lowered his gaze, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. I just didn't want anyone to get hurt. The billionaire's eyes softened. For the first time that day, his polished charm was gone, replaced with raw honesty. And that, he said slowly, makes you braver than most people I know. The hall erupted in murmurs, some clapping, others nodding in agreement. The teachers looked stunned, realizing how close they had come to disaster. The principal, red-faced, stammered apologies to both Mr. Harrison and the students, but the focus wasn't on him anymore. It wasn't even on the spoiled food. It was on David, the boy who had spoken up, the boy who had remembered his brother's suffering and turned it into action that saved everyone else. The revelation wasn't just about the food. It was about the courage to speak, even when your voice shakes. It was about how the smallest person in the room could carry the biggest truth. Mr. Harrison glanced once more at the tray, then pushed it far away. He stood slowly, adjusting his suit, and turned toward the students. His voice was steady now, but there was a weight in it that hadn't been there during his polished speech. Today, I came here to inspire you, he said. But instead, I'm the one who's been humbled. I thought I was here to teach, but this young man has reminded me of something more important. Courage doesn't come from wealth or power or age. It comes from seeing the truth and daring to speak it. He looked directly at David, and for that, I thank you. The students clapped loudly now, the sound filling the hall. David's classmates patted his back, some whispering, "Good job, and you saved us." His face burned, but his heart swelled with something new, pride mixed with relief. The applause faded slowly, leaving behind a heavy quiet. Students still looked at David with wide eyes, some whispering his name, others shaking their heads in disbelief at what had just unfolded. The billionaire, however, was no longer smiling. His expression had hardened into something sharper, serious. Controlled, but edged with anger, he turned toward the row of kitchen staff, standing nervously near the wall. Their white aprons looked less like uniforms now, and more like evidence of guilt. His eyes locked on them, and the room seemed to shrink under the weight of his stare. "Who prepared this?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a dangerous strength. The staff shifted, their feet shuffling against the floor. One older man stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Sir, it was a mistake," he stammered. "The chicken was supposed to be thrown out. One of the trays got mixed up. We didn't realize." The billionaire's jaw clenched. He picked up the tray again, holding it out as if presenting evidence. "This mistake," he said, his voice low, "could have poisoned me. Could have poisoned hundreds of children." Gasps swept through the hall. The students leaned closer, their stomachs twisting at the thought. Teachers looked pale. Realizing just how close they had all come to catastrophe, the principal rushed forward, trying to smooth things over. "Sir, please, there was no harm done. Thanks to the boy, everything is fine. Let's not make this worse." But Mr. Harrison's eyes narrowed at him. "No harm done?" His voice cut through the air like a blade. "Your students nearly ate spoiled food. Your guest nearly ate spoiled food. You allowed this to happen under your watch. And you think there is no harm done?" The principal's face went scarlet. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The hall remained deathly still, the students staring at the adults with new suspicion. Mr. Harrison set the tray down with deliberate care, as though even touching it disgusted him. Then he turned back toward the staff. Negligence is not a small thing. It destroys trust. It puts lives at risk. And today, it nearly destroyed the purpose of this entire event. David sat quietly in his chair now, watching the confrontation unfold. His heart still raced, but he felt a strange sense of justice seeing the billionaire speak so firmly. It was as though the weight of responsibility, usually invisible to students, was now laid bare for all to see. The older man in the apron lowered his head. "We're sorry, sir," he said quietly. "It won't happen again." But Mr. Harrison wasn't finished. He turned toward the principal once more. "You organized this event. You were so focused on appearances, on cameras, on speeches, on how impressive it would all look that you failed the one duty that mattered most, the safety of your students." The words struck like thunder. The principal's shoulders slumped, his earlier pride completely stripped away. He could only nod weakly, shame burning across his face. Students began to murmur again. For them, this was more than drama. It was the truth of how close they had been to danger, and how easily the adults they trusted had overlooked it. Many glanced back at David, realizing just how much his voice had changed the outcome. Finally, the billionaire's gaze softened not toward the staff, not toward the principal, but toward David. His voice lowered. But the entire room leaned in to hear. And yet, when everyone else failed to notice, one boy did. One boy saved us all. The hall erupted in applause again, louder, longer. David's cheeks flushed, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as his classmates patted his back. He felt both embarrassed and proud, his heart swelling with a strange new confidence. Mr. Harrison let the applause settle before speaking again. "This is not about punishing mistakes," he said. "It's about accountability. It's about recognizing how easily arrogance, carelessness, or obsession with appearances can put lives at risk." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the hall. "And it's about remembering that sometimes the smallest voices are the ones that matter most." The confrontation had shifted the tone of the entire day. The teachers stood in awkward silence, the staff hung their heads, and the principal looked as though he might crumble. But the students, they looked inspired. They looked at David like he had become more than just a classmate. He was a hero. As Mr. Harrison sat back down, the weight of the moment settled over everyone. It was no longer about spoiled food. It was about truth, courage, and the lesson that even the most powerful can be humbled by the smallest among them. The hall felt different now. The excitement that had filled the air when the billionaire first walked in was gone. In its place was something heavier, but more meaningful, a silence that carried respect, humility, and reflection. Students still whispered David's name. Teachers stood awkwardly, as if they were rethinking every decision that had led to this moment. The principal avoided everyone's gaze, his pride shattered. The kitchen staff huddled near the door, shame heavy on their shoulders. But in the middle of it all sat David, small compared to the adults around him. Yet somehow the largest presence in the room. Mr. Harrison rose slowly from his chair. The billionaire everyone had admired for his wealth and power looked different now. He no longer wore the polished smile of a man used to cameras. His face was serious, his eyes softer, and his voice carried a weight that made the room lean in. "When I came here today," he began, "I thought I was the one who would teach you something. I thought my story of success, my journey, would inspire you. But the truth is, I am the one who has learned a lesson." Students sat straighter, their eyes fixed on him. David lowered his gaze, embarrassed. But his classmates nudged him, whispering, "He's talking about you." Mr. Harrison turned toward David. "This young man reminded me that no amount of money, no amount of success can protect you from every danger. What saves us, what protects us, is awareness, courage, and the willingness to speak up even when you are afraid." The hall broke into applause again. This time stronger, filled with emotion. Some teachers clapped with tears in their eyes, realizing how close they had come to disaster. Students clapped until their hands hurt, their voices rising in cheers. But Mr. Harrison raised a hand, and the room quieted once more. The lesson here is not just that spoiled food was caught in time. The lesson is that courage can come from anyone. Greatness is not measured by wealth or age. Sometimes, it is measured by 3 simple words shouted at the right time. "Don't eat that." His words sank deep into every listener. For the students, it was a revelation that their voices mattered. For the staff and teachers, it was a reminder of responsibility. For David, it was confirmation that his fear had turned into something powerful, something that mattered. The billionaire walked across the hall, every step echoing. He stopped in front of David, who looked up nervously. The man extended his hand, his eyes warm now, stripped of pride. "Thank you," he said simply. "You didn't just save me. You saved everyone here. And you taught us all something we won't forget." David hesitated, then slowly reached out and shook his hand. The students erupted again, cheering louder than ever. In that moment, the billionaire and the boy were equals, not divided by money or power, but connected by truth and courage. Later, as the event wound down, the spoiled food was cleared away, and the cameras captured their final images. The real story had already been written. It wasn't the billionaire's speech that people would remember. It wasn't the principal's pride or the banners on the wall. It was the image of a student standing up, shouting against silence, and saving the day. That night, whispers of the story spread beyond the school. Parents heard it from their children, neighbors from each other. And soon the community knew. A boy had stopped a billionaire from eating spoiled food. But those who were there knew it was more than that. It was a story about courage, about speaking up, and about how even the smallest voice could echo the loudest truth. For David, the lesson was simple, but life-changing. He had been afraid, but he had spoken. And in doing so, he discovered that his voice carried power. For Mr. Harrison, the lesson was humbling. He had come to teach, but left reminded that no matter how high you climb, you are never too great to be saved by someone smaller. And for everyone else in that hall, the lesson was clear: never ignore the truth, no matter who it comes from. Sometimes it takes only a single shout to stop disaster and to remind the world that courage doesn't wear a suit, doesn't come with billions, and doesn't always sit at the front of the room. Sometimes courage sits in the middle row,